I think, okay, we're recording. So Tara is here to help me keep an eye on the chat. So if you have any questions as we go through, you can just put them in the chat and she'll answer them, or we can discuss at the end, either way. And then we're just going to try to keep everyone on mute to help cut down on any background noise. And so today we're talking about floodproofing. So we're going to start with wet floodproofing, and then I'll move into dry floodproofing and when each of them are used and all the documentation that goes with that. So wet floodproofing is having measures applied to a structure or contents that allows floodwaters to enter the structure or the area, which generally includes having that structure anchored, making sure that flood damage resistant materials are used below the base flood elevation, and then some measure of protection for mechanical and utility equipment, which is usually elevating or potentially floodproofing those as well. But as far as wet floodproofing, typically that's going to be elevated. And so I'll talk about when this is an appropriate measure to use in a structure as far as the NFIP, when we can authorize it. And so it's limited to enclosures below elevated residential structures and then non-residential structures as far as agricultural structures and accessory structures. So those specifically, those two, all other non-residential structures either have to be elevated or dry flood proofed. And so all residential structures have to be elevated, and there is no other floodproofing option for that. But wet floodproofing is by far the most common that you'll be working with and is required for compliant enclosures. And so this is the FEMA language, just kind of the bare minimum for enclosures below the lowest floor. So I'll show you a couple of examples of residential structures with enclosures. But this isn't everyone's ordinance, it's required to be in there. And so basically, if you have an elevated residential structure with an enclosure, so that's either a partial or full story enclosure, or we'd be talking about a crawl space, that it would have a minimum of 2 openings on 2 different walls, having a total net area of not less than 1 square inch per every 1 square foot of enclosed space. And so we call that the 1-to-1 ratio. And that's the minimum for having enough openings. And we are talking about the net opening. And so I think I have a few slides on that. If not, I can talk a little bit more about openings later on. And potential coverings that could interfere with that number. But other than that, they are no higher than 1 foot above grade. And then the last sentence here does kind of address that, having screens, louvers, valves, other coverings, provided that they work automatically with no human intervention to allow the entry and exit of floodwaters freely. And again, making sure that those coverings still allow for the 1-to-1 ratio there. And so when I did my NFIP basics class a few weeks ago, I kind of threw out a trick question by mistake, just asking what kind of structures can be wet flood proofed. And a lot of people said residential structures. And I think I just kind of misconstrued the wording there. So I wouldn't say we wet flood proof residential structures because it kind of implies the living floor. It's just the enclosures below the lowest floor of a residential structure. So I just wanted to clear that up in case any of you were part of that. And just kind of making it clear that we're just talking about areas underneath the elevated floor. And so in this example, we have a crawl space and you can see the flood openings in the wall, at least 2 openings on different sides. So they don't have to be opposite side walls, just at least 2 different walls. Again, no more than 1 foot above grade. And this is from our NFIP quick guide or our Kansas quick guide. It's a sketch from that book and it kind of goes over a few things such as having the underfloor utilities. Those would be elevated to or above the base flood elevation. So we'd want to keep that kind of stuff out of the crawl space as it's wet flood proofed. You don't want those to get wet. the best option is to always elevate everything and then having the interior grade of the crawl space at or above the exterior grade so you don't have a basement. But I have lots of other courses that talk about that. And then here's another sketch of this from the Homeowner's Guide to Retrofitting. So here's another crawl space with more flood openings that you can see here. Again, we're trying to meet the 1-to-1 ratio. And then this one also has an attached garage that's built at grade and also wet flood proofed. So that's another part of a residential structure that could be wet flood proofed. It's not the living floor. It's an at grade garage that's used only for storage, parking, or building access. And then the crawl space wouldn't really be used for anything. It's just to elevate the rest of the structure. So, okay. So another issue with this that commonly happens is that people will completely cover their flood openings for different reasons. Sometimes, you know, they say the floors get cold in the winter, or I hear a lot about pests or raccoons, that kind of thing, getting into the flood openings and causing issues. We have the flood openings to equalize pressure from flood water pushing in on the foundation walls. And so to equalize the pressure, we have this free flow of water. Otherwise, it could collapse the foundation wall, which is a lot of structural damage. That's going to be big as far as, you know, insurance claims or making repairs on that. It could push someone over the substantial damage threshold. So there's a lot of issues with, you know, people covering these up and then not having that properly wet flood proofed, and then that will cause issues later on. So in this case, this property owner covered them, and then the floodplain manager found out about it and they uncovered them, and then they went back and recovered them. So there's a lot of back and forth on this one. They're kind of on a watch list at this point to periodically go by and make sure that they haven't covered them, which might be something that happens. A good option for someone like this that doesn't want the flood openings could be to have engineered openings. So those automatically open and close with the rising of floodwater. They don't require any human intervention for them to work. And so they're a little bit more expensive, but you wouldn't have to worry about any of the other issues with having the open hole into the enclosure. So that, or if you have a retrofit project where they have to put in flood openings or additional openings, engineered openings might be a good option for that because they're rated for so much net opening, and that might decrease the number of openings that have to be installed into an enclosure. So you can find engineered openings just looking online. Like I said, they're a little bit more expensive, but they could help someone in that case. So here's what I meant when I said partial enclosure. So this would be a diagram 6 if you're looking at the elevation certificate. So it's an enclosure that is underneath the elevated residential structure, but it's not completely as wide as the rest of the house. It's only underneath part of it, and that would be in the floodplain, and it should have flood openings there, and it wouldn't be a living space. Again, it's just parking, building access, or storage for that. And then another enclosure, this is the full story enclosure, so this would be a diagram 7. So basically they have like a full story garage that is, you know, like a complete garage, the same size as the rest of the house underneath, and you can see the flood openings there. On this structure, you can also see the high water line where this house was inundated for about 2 months after, I think it's the Missouri River that it's adjacent to, but yeah, so this was used for just, you know, parking, storage, building access, so they were able to return to the structure with just minimal cleaning and repair, and it really didn't take any damage. So that's how it's supposed to function. It allowed floodwater to go in and out, and so the foundation walls are perfectly fine in this case, and that's also why we limit the use of those enclosures. Okay, so aside from enclosures underneath residential structures, as I said, the other two things that we can wet flood proof, and these are pretty common. I get questions about these all the time. Every time we do an audit, there's several accessory structures that have gone in unpermitted. So they pop up all the time in the floodplain. People might not realize that they need separate permits, and so doing outreach can help. Another thing is that there are accessory structure like companies that can do delivery of accessory structures, and they don't really address permitting every time they deliver something or take an order or whatever the case may be. They're not looking at maps, and so doing outreach to those companies might at least back you up when you tell property owners that they need permits and they say they weren't told that they need permits. So doing whatever you can to make sure everyone is aware of that. But yeah, accessory structures either need to be elevated or wet flood proofed, and there are certain conditions for them to be in the floodplain and be allowed to be wet flood proofed. If they don't meet these requirements, then they have to be elevated. And so they're not habitable, they're anchored, they're made of flood damage resistant materials. And of course, the wet flood proofing is having the flood openings or the flood vents 600 square feet or less. So that's about the size of a 2-car garage, and FEMA says about 600 square feet. So if they're any larger than that, then they would need a variance, and they really shouldn't be much larger than that. If it's a lot larger, like twice the size, sometimes we see very large accessory structures in the floodplain, then those should be elevated. If there's any utilities, those need to be elevated to or above the base flood elevation. And then that may trigger the requirement for an elevation certificate to verify that those utilities are elevated high enough. Because kind of the point of having this exception is to relieve the financial burden of having to elevate these small, low-cost structures. And so that's kind of the point of keeping them small, is so that they're low cost, low damage potential. And if they are, meeting all of these requirements, then they don't need an elevation certificate and they don't need a variance. It would just be a floodplain permit. And so all of these rules that I'm going to go over as far as wet flood proofing have been recently updated, and new guidance has come out from FEMA. The same for dry flood proofing, actually. There's been a lot of clarification on this, and there has kind of historically been some misunderstandings about how these things are allowed to be authorized by the floodplain administrator. So hopefully we'll clear some of that up today. So the uses are still pretty much the same as an enclosure, storage, or parking only. It cannot be modified for a different use in the future. And as an accessory structure, it has to be an accessory to a principal structure. So we have had cases where there's a lot with just the one accessory structure on it and there's no principal structure. And so in that case, it's not an accessory to anything, and then it would have to be elevated or dry flood proofed. So just keeping that in mind, it does have to be on the same piece of property as the principal structure and then incidental to the use of the principal structure. So typically we're talking about like gardening sheds, tool sheds, just small, low cost, low damage potential structures is the intention here for wet flood proofing. No commercial uses, so we run into that at times. The same with ag buildings, which I'll talk about next, but there's no like wholesale, retail, employment, entertainment type of uses. So here's a good example. This one is elevated, so it's not wet flood proofed, which is why it doesn't have flood openings, but it is elevated, it's anchored, the utilities are elevated. This one is a tool shed. And then another bad example where it's definitely not wet flood proof. There's no flood openings on it. I'm not sure about the materials, but it's definitely not anchored. If you zoom in, it's just kind of resting on these logs. So it's got several things wrong here. It's not properly elevated or anchored the materials or wet flood proofed, and it may also be a code enforcement issue. So we've seen multiple cases like this. The same thing here, definitely not the right materials. It's not elevated or anchored. So again, doing outreach, making sure that people know about the requirements for accessory structures. And again, this might be another code enforcement violation. So coordinating with those other departments to make sure that everyone is working in conjunction on making sure that structures are compliant. And so that's kind of the long and short of accessory structures. That's pretty straightforward, whereas agricultural structures are quite varied as far as their uses. And so I'll show you some of the new guidance that FEMA has put out, but basically all all agricultural structures need variances to be authorized for wet flood proofing now. So that was their intention originally, and then it kind of got misconstrued. Like nationwide, there was a misconception about this, but all ag structures need a variance to be wet flood proofed, and they have made that clear. And it's because ag structures are very diverse in what they are and how they're used. And so I've kind of added another graphic from the quick guide. So we're looking again at low damage potential structures. So pole frame buildings, steel grain bins, which those are usually elevated because of the grain. But corn cribs, feeding barns, stuff open on one side. So again, we're trying to move away from livestock, poultry, milking parlors. Anything that has live animals in it should really be elevated or dry flood proofed. So the community ultimately has authority to grant variances, but there's quite a bit in the new FEMA, like the full publication P-2140 that I'll show you, but they're really trying to move away from those types of agricultural structures because they're not low damage potential. There could be safety issues for the animals in that case. Things could leak out into the floodwaters as far as ag chemicals that could be dangerous or hazardous and that kind of thing. So if you're not sure, I would definitely take a look at that publication. And so there's no size limit on ag structures, but they do have to meet the definition. And that is, it's used solely for agricultural purposes in connection with production, harvesting, storage, drying, or raising of agricultural commodities, which could include livestock. As listed here, that still counts as an ag building, but it shouldn't be wet flood proofed. And so as long as it's low damage potential, it can be constructed at grade and wet flood proofed, no human habitation or occupancy. It's of single wall design, no permanent retail, wholesale, or manufacturing use included in the structure. And so that has been an issue in the past. There are certain agritainment businesses, pumpkin patches, or other types of structures where they're kind of selling the plants or other ag commodities out of that building. And so that would preclude it from being able to be wet flood proof. Then it would have to be elevated, most likely. So just trying to distinguish that. So like in this case, this structure is completely open on one side. So it has 3 walls. The other one is completely open. There's no door. We have been able to count that as wet flood proofed. So there really wouldn't be any point in putting flood openings in the other 3 walls if it's missing an entire wall. So that is something that we have done before. But now that would need a variance. So all of these are supposed to have variances. Again, there's no size limitation. This is a good example of one. it's quite large, but that's fine as long as it's still meeting the 1-to-1 ratio on having the flood openings. So you can see there are at least 4 on this side, presumably more on the opposite side or in the back, and meeting the use requirements. And this one is anchored and made of the appropriate materials. So that is what we're looking for. Hopefully it's low damage potential. So this was released in 2020. And so this is the FEMA policy on agricultural and accessory structures. This was released, I think, before the full document. So this is kind of a condensed version of that, but it does work in conjunction with the new technical bulletin 7 on wet floodproofing that was released in May of 2022. And so that's why it says it supersedes technical bulletin 1, 5, and 7 as far as these types of structures. Like I said, the new technical bulletin 7 was released after this. And so it does coincide with what that says, but again, accessory structures are on the same parcel as the principal and use is incidental to that. And so this is nice to have as like a quick reference if you need more in-depth information or sample documents or whatever. The 2140 is what you should look at. So agricultural structures only. In P-2140, it does talk about repetitive loss and substantial damage concerns as far as agricultural structures, other hazards, restoration, permitting, having no disaster assistance. It has to be properly wet flood proofed if it's going to have flood insurance. And then something that came up recently is the KSA 12-758. And so this is a state law that kind of exempts agricultural uses. And so there is a little bit of a misconception, or there has been in some communities, that it will exempt them from floodplain regulations. But if you read subpart B, it says except for floodplain regulations, it's exempt. So they still have to conform with floodplain regulations, whether that's elevating dry floodproofing or meeting the requirements for wet floodproofing and getting the variance. So just putting that out there because it came up recently and we are familiar with it. People have brought it up to us before. So KSA does exempt ag structures and buildings from other land use regulations except for floodplain regulations. Those still have to be followed. So again, we're trying to reduce the financial burden on these low damage potential structures. And so we're talking about walled and roofed structures. There are some ag buildings like holding pens, tanks, or pools as far as aquaculture. Those kinds of things don't count as structures as long as they're made of the right materials and they're anchored and permitted. Those should be fine. And again, no habitation, employment, or entertainment. And FEMA has kind of really clarified what they mean as far as being allowed to be wet flood proofed. Again, accessory structures, it's the same thing. We're talking about actual structures that are walled and roofed. So having at least 2 rigid walls and secured roof. So we're talking like detached garages, walled and roofed carports, storage and tool sheds, maybe small boat houses, not gazebos, pavilions, picnic shelters, or the carports that are open on all sides. Again, as long as those are made of the appropriate materials, they're anchored, and they have permits, those are fine. Again, employment or entertainment is not something that we would want to include in that use. And the same goes for agricultural structures. Okay. So typically, and we're working on our model ordinances right now for the state that basically you'd have a section in your specific standards about the requirements for agricultural structures or accessory structures and what requirements they have to meet. And then you'd have a section in your variance for that. And so definitely a variance section for the ag structures. Some communities adopt them as well for accessory structures, that even accessory structures would have to be granted a variance, which is fine. again, we should have new model language out sometime in the near-ish future as we go through revisions with that. But the regulations are our mechanism of compliance where we outline all of the requirements. And so we have to meet the definition and the use, having walled and roofed. So we want minimal investments and low damage potential. And so our overall message is usually don't grant variances for anything. Sorry. This type of variance is a little bit different. So in being a minimal investment or low damage potential, it kind of qualifies for a variance more than your typical residential or non-residential structure because we have these exclusive use requirements. And so it's more justified than the other types of structures. So they kind of have this built-in exemption variance type. So just kind of distinguishing that from other types of variances where I often get questions like, when can we do variances? Typically, you have to go through all the criteria that is listed in your variance section. As I said, this would have its own separate variance section. So it does follow that criteria, but it's a little bit more justified just based on the nature of the structure. So I just kind of want to put that out there. You can get an exception community-wide to allow for wet floodproofing of ag structures without the variance. And so this is based on the new guidance from FEMA. I have yet to see an application for that, and FEMA doesn't have any examples for me. So if you do apply for that, or if you know of an application, I would really like to see it because I don't entirely know what they're looking for, like how in depth. But basically, based on your local flooding conditions, you would kind of make a case to FEMA that, you know, with the hardship of enforcing variances, and if your flooding is like low velocity, low depth, you could go over the inequities in your community and putting forth that sufficient justification for economic, environmental, topographic, your hydrologic and hydraulic situation. So having your technical data demonstrating the low impact to public safety and welfare, that kind of thing, include data on your flooding conditions, the kind of duration, frequency, depth, warning time, and safety and access that you have. And you make this case to FEMA, and the regional office will let you know if you can get your community exception granted. Again, so this would be just for allowing the accessory structures and the agricultural structures to just be permitted without getting a variance because, you know, they're not at great risk and they're not going to put the public at risk in your community because of your flooding conditions and all of that other data. So again, I don't have any examples of that or what it would look like entirely, and they've been a little bit vague about it. So that is an option, apparently. So this is the full document. This is P-2140. This was put out in 2020. And so this is a long version of that FEMA policy that I showed you. And it kind of combines technical bulletin 7 and it just goes over all of the information. There's a lot more definitions, examples, specific construction standards, how to combine wet and dry floodproofing techniques together, other types of structures, like trying to better protect development that's not structures, administrative variance responsibilities, and the types of ag structures that could pose a danger that we don't want to wet floodproof. You know, the ones that have like chemicals or animals, that kind of stuff. There's also model language for ordinance amendments. And as I said, repetitive loss and substantial damage information in there as well. So if that's an issue, definitely take a look at that. And so that's basically wet floodproofing in a nutshell. I'll spend a little bit of time talking about dry floodproofing. And so I have another slide. Okay, I should probably start with this one. So just to compare, as we're transitioning from wet floodproofing, which again just allows water into the enclosure or the compliant structure to allow the pressure to equalize, dry floodproofing is basically the opposite of that, where we're making a building and its utilities watertight and substantially impermeable to floodwater. So we're trying to create a structure or outfit a structure in such a way that the water will not infiltrate during conditions of flooding. And so this is a much more difficult feat to accomplish. There's a lot more certification and engineering that would go into a design like this. And so I don't think we have any structures like this in Kansas, not that we could find. So if you know of one, let me know. But I don't think you're likely to deal with this, but in case anyone asks you about it, here's a little background on it. And just so that we have some familiarization with what's required for dry floodproofing. So we have active versus passive measures. And so the active measures have to be implemented by a person, whereas the passive measures, like reinforced glass for windows, just kind of work on their own without any intervention. So there are mixed use structures. If they are, such as a hotel, the non-residential areas can be dry flood proofed. Residential areas would have to be elevated. There's the flood protection level as far as insurance considerations. So whether or not you get credit for being dry flood proofed, it depends on how high it is. Okay. So the Technical Bulletin 3 2021 update was the first update since I think 1993. So I'm just kind of comparing the table of contents for both of them. So the old version was 10 pages. The new one is like 30 some pages. I think it's more like 40 with all of the references in it. So basically all of the sections have been expanded. They break down the design into a 10-step process. There's a better explanation of the relationship between these things. And the technical references, they now require that the design complies with the ACE 24 publication, which is the American Society for Civil Engineers. And so it has to comply with those requirements. So it's a little bit more technically challenging, and there's a bit of a higher standard now. So that publication is the accepted standard of practice, and they have written that into the floodproofing certificate that it's going to comply with that. And so if we're talking about an existing building, the site assessment, we have to determine whether dry floodproofing is an appropriate thing to do based on the structural and architectural integrity of the building. Can it withstand having these implementations added onto it? We have to look at the flood warning time, the functional use requirements, how long the building can be shut down, because it's usually, you know, a business that's running. So how long can it be shut down? Safety and access before, during, and after the flood conditions, because if there are active measures, the personnel has to get out there, deploy the measures, and then evacuate during the flood warning times. So based on the answer to those questions, is floodproofing appropriate? Maybe elevating is usually what is done. It doesn't seem like dry floodproofing is really like a cheaper option. It's definitely not easier. So that's likely why we don't see it used very often. The same thing for the utilities, the mechanical, plumbing, gas systems, the electrical, those should be elevated. We can also floodproof those and put them like in its own enclosure with flood walls around it, that kind of thing, or it could be designed to be submerged, whatever the case may be, we have to consider those as well. And then there are 2 required plans for emergency operations and then maintenance and inspection. So None of that information was in the older technical bulletin, so they've really amped it up, probably because of the rate of failure on dry floodproofing. And so because of that, there's a lot of planning that goes into this. It has to comply with the floodplain management regulations. We're trying to reduce damage below the level of dry floodproofing. We have to have safe and responsible deployment of those active measures, and it has to be feasible. And then we have to do maintenance and inspections as we go along to make sure that everything is going to work when we need it. The operations plan so that everyone knows what their role is during the emergency operations phase. The flood warnings and how that's issued and all of that. And then there's always a level of residual risk, which is whatever risk is left over to the property owner, because this could fail, and how much of that risk can be offset by their insurance policies. So there's a lot to think about if they are going to, attempt to dry flood proof or design a new building to be dry flood proof. So again, the active measures require the human interaction. They have to go out and deploy those, and the passive measures just are already installed and they just work during the flood. So of course we always have extreme events that are higher than what we predicted, higher water levels than expected, longer inundation. There could be undetected weaknesses in the system where water can seep through some kind of area of weakness. There, as in unidentified points of entry, measures could be poorly maintained, not properly inspected, insufficient resistant to flood loads. So there's all these different loads acting on the building. If that's been miscalculated, there could be failure, or somehow the personnel does not deploy the active measures. So really anything can go wrong here. So this is just kind of a list of examples of stuff that is implemented on either the existing or the new structure to make it dry flood proof, so that you can reinforce the walls, make sure those are strong enough to resist the flood loads, the watertight doors and windows. There's all these paints and membranes, sealants and water resistant stuff like that to try to reduce seepage. You have to have sump pumps. So that's a requirement under the new technical bulletin. Having backflow and shutoff valves for the plumbing systems. Flood shields are a big one. You definitely need backup power sources for the sump pump just in case you lose power. And the window glazing is the reinforced glass that I was talking about. And so whatever measures are chosen and implemented are based on the site specific conditions for that building or that site. Again, the required plans, emergency and operations, and then maintenance and inspections. So you as a community should require the submission of these two plans if someone is wanting to make a design like this. It could be added to your ordinance or building codes potentially if you're going to do that. And then these plans are required if they're going to apply for insurance and to get the floodproofing credit for that. And then FEMA will review those and then determine the eligibility for that credit on their insurance. So these are all the requirements for the emergency operations plans. It's pretty extensive. I don't have to go through everything here, but just to show you everything that goes into the planning for this. Basically, we need a chain of command and a set of benchmarks that trigger each of these things to happen to notify the personnel, and they have to get out there. They have to have the instructions. They need contact information to get a hold of manufacturers. They might have to work with heavy equipment. They need to know where everything is. So just all of this, and then having some kind of evacuation plan for after they've deployed all of these measures. And so that's why they definitely need drills and training on this beforehand. And then after an event, we would go back and review this plan and see where we need to improve. And then inspection and maintenance plan requirements. So making sure that everything is, the way that it was, the foundation system is still intact the way that it was. There are no cracks or other areas of penetration that have not been identified before now. All of the materials, the panels, the doors, the gates, the shields, all of that, we need to make sure that that's in working order. You don't want to find out that some of that is broken or missing during a flood event. Make sure the sump pumps are working, test the generators and all of that. And then having some kind of schedule where you're going to go back and do the maintenance and inspection again. And so a lot of companies, if you're looking at dry floodproofing products, so there are companies that make this stuff. There's like inflatable flood walls and all of these kinds of different things that you can buy. You can get custom made stuff. And so a lot of them claim to be FEMA approved, which I think they would have to verify that in some way to be able to claim that. And also compliance with the ACE 24. Some of them have pre-made plans for maintenance and inspection and operations for these particular products that you can buy. Some of them are pre-calculated, and some of the companies also provide training on the installation and stuff. So if you're ever looking into that, the companies may provide some of that information. And so FEMA has added this section into the new technical bulletin 3 on what has contributed to dry floodproofing failure over the years, probably to try to warn people against what some of the major issues have been, such as lack of detailed plans that have all of the installation instructions and the requirements, inspection and maintenance that doesn't have enough detail. Ownership could change, and then the new owners are completely unaware of their dry floodproofing system and how that's supposed to work. Missing, damaged, or leaking equipment during the time of flooding, or sometimes they'll have contractors come out and do work, and then they are modifying the floodproofing system without even realizing it. And so that's why the plans are pretty critical to the effectiveness of dry floodproofing. And if those are deficient, pretty much the entire system is deficient as well. So there could also be BFE changes to the maps or other issues. Any number of issues could contribute to the failure here, and then that would be pretty catastrophic. So again, likely why this is not utilized very often. This is the non-residential floodproofing certificate for non-residential structures. And so like the current elevation certificate, this is now expired. And we're just kind of in a grace period until such time that FEMA releases a new one. And so this has a little bit of instructions. It talks about the purpose for insurance and compliance. And so it looks a lot like the elevation certificate. And so making sure that it complies with the ordinance and that it complies with the ACE 24 publication. So it's pretty straightforward information here as far as the building information, and then the map information is pretty much the same as it is on the elevation certificate. The floodproofing elevation, the datum, and then zone specific information towards the bottom there. And then it just gets certified. And so they add their certificate, the seal, and their signature to ensure that they are providing accurate information. And then the section 3 is that the design is constructed in accordance with ACE 24, either the 2005 or the 2014 version. And then they sign and seal that as well. And then they provide a copy to the community official and insurance agent. And so again, you should require them to submit the 2 plans as well. And then sometimes after an event, you might require that an objective third party does a review on those plans and make sure that they are not deficient. So They also have to provide photographs of all of these different measures, and then it goes into a bit more detail on that. So that is kind of the synopsis of dry flood proofing. Again, you probably won't work with it, but if someone asks you about it, you can kind of give them this information, which I'm sure will deter them. Again, I have not seen anyone do this as of yet, and I've been here about 3 years. So the other thing is residential basement exemption. And so we often have issues with basements in the floodplain. Of course, that's not allowed unless you're part of this program. And we only have 9 active communities in this program. That's Colwich, Derby, Great Bend, Halstead, Lindsborg, Rossville, Salina, Saline County, and Sedgwick. And most of them don't use the program anymore. There have been a lot of issues with violations and improper documentation on it. And so it's not a very active program, at least in Kansas. But they adopt these standards into their regulations. So again, you have to be approved for this program by FEMA first, and then you have to follow these specific regulations and put that in your ordinance. So it's for low velocity areas, low depth, 5 feet or less. Then you flood proof the basement at least 1 foot above the BFE. The top of the basement floor cannot be more than 5 feet below the base flood elevation. And then you have to put fill around that and have vegetative cover on that. And then you have it certified by an architect or an engineer that it's watertight. And then the community official is supposed to inspect that and verify that it's designed in compliance. And so there's a separate residential basement flood proofing certificate that's different from the certificate I just showed you. So if you look this up on the FEMA website, it does say the community has to have this exemption from FEMA prior to allowing this construction. So we have had issues with communities trying to adopt regulations like this without being in the program or using the regular non-residential floodproofing certificate for residential basements, which are completely different. And it doesn't have all the required regulations that I just showed you. So there have been a lot of issues with this, or just being part of the program and then not requiring these certificates and just having regular basements put in without verifying that it's actually flood proofed. So I'm not sure if FEMA would let more communities join this, but we have had quite a few issues with it. Of course, we always have issues with floodplains and basements. People are always trying to put basements in there, especially with Lomar Fs, and we're trying to deal with that. But yeah, so this program hasn't been super beneficial, but it is part of the FEMA program. So this is what the certificate looks like. This one does not expire until 2024. And it's pretty straightforward building information. And then they just certify that it meets all of the regulations that I showed you. So it kind of has a synopsis of that. Again, ACE 24 in there. And that it complies with those specific residential basement regulations. And then they sign and seal that. And then this is what's supposed to be provided to the floodplain manager for the communities in this program. Of course, it can fail just as much as any other dry flood proofing. So we haven't seen it, again, do much for communities. It's kind of like having a sunken living room into the floor, but again, it can't be more than 5 feet below the base flood elevation, so they're not usually very deep. Again, we've had issues with this, with a lot of violations, and again, using the wrong certificate or not having a certificate or whatever the case may be. And then we've had basement flooding and failure as well, which of course contributes to structural damage. And then there's a bit of information in here. I don't really need to go too far in depth about the basements and insurance discount, but as long as they are properly flood-proofed, then they can get that insurance credit, just like other dry floodproofing. And then we haven't seen much, or I haven't heard much about the re-rating under risk rating 2.0 with these basements, so I don't really have much to give you there. But other than that, we are always encouraging people to use other floodproofing measures. It doesn't help with the insurance premium, but if you can, putting in berms, using the backflow valves, having flood walls, whatever you can do to divert water away from a structure is still valuable as far as not getting water in your house or the business or whatever the case. Those types of measures are still useful. And so again, wet and dry are kind of opposite. They have opposite goals of either allowing water in or trying to keep water out as much as possible. Wet floodproofing, you need the elevation certificate potentially, depends on what it is. Maybe a variance, always a permit, everything needs a permit. The dry floodproofing needs the other certificate and an elevation certificate and a permit, of course. Wet floodproofing, very common, very simple requirements and everything, whereas dry is an extremely complicated system. Dry floodproofing can fail, and then that is pretty devastating if it does. So yeah, I think that's pretty much the wrap up on this. We have a couple of minutes for questions, but okay, I'm gonna stop sharing my screen. Okay, so it looks like, sorry, there's only been like one question.
There was one question that I think I answered, but I didn't see any others come through. But does anybody have any other questions?
I'm sure I will as I go through this, but interesting process.
Right. And so, yeah, if anyone thinks of anything later on, feel free to get in touch with either of us. We're happy to help with any situations.
Well, thank you.
Yep.
And Cheyenne, did you talk about the CEC credit for CFMs if they wanted it?
Right. Okay. So if you want the credit for the 1 CEC for certified floodplain managers, just send me an email because I don't send them out automatically. So just let me know if you want one. Also appreciate those of you who participated in the pre-training survey. I'm going to be sending out a post-training survey, and that way we can get your feedback and hopefully improve these courses in the future. So I'd appreciate your participation in that. And otherwise, I hope you guys have a great rest of your day.